Okay, let's do a deep dive into something that might catch you a little off guard, especially when you hear its original job. Low-dose naltrexone, or LEN. We're going to explore its potential uses, focusing specifically on the surprising links the source material draws to anxiety and mental health.
Yeah, it's definitely an unexpected connection for many people.
So the information we're unpacking today, it comes from a pretty detailed presentation. It was given by a pharmacist at Healthy Choice Compounding Pharmacy.
Right. So we're looking at it from their perspective, their understanding of LDN.
Exactly, like its history, how they think it works at this low dose, and the practical side, how it's used, including, well, these really interesting potential links to mental well-being.
Mm.
Our mission today is pretty simple. We want to cut through the complexity and pull out the most impactful ideas from this presentation for you.
Yeah, to understand the core concepts about how LDN might, and that's a key word, how it might play a role in supporting mental health.
Right, what the source shares about the science behind it and the research landscape as they described it. So, yeah, get ready to maybe look at this medication in a whole new light.
Definitely.
So naltrexone itself, it's not new, right? Its story goes back quite a way.
Oh, yeah, decades. The origin of naltrexone is really with a much higher dose. It was first synthesized, I think, back in the early 60s.
Okay.
And then by the early 70s, it was being used clinically, typically around 50 milligrams.
Which was for a really specific and, well, totally different purpose than what we're focused on now.
Absolutely. At that 50 milligram dose, the goal was basically a total blockade of opioid receptors in the brain.
Complete block.
Complete block. It was really effective for treating things like heroin addiction, alcohol addiction too. The whole idea was block those receptors completely. So if someone used, say, opioids or drank alcohol, they wouldn't get wouldn't feel the effect.
Okay, so high dose equals complete block, mainly for addiction. Got it. But the source talks about this pivotal shift, a discovery at a tiny, tiny fraction of that dose.
Right, and this is where it gets really fascinating and kind of unexpected. Back in the early 80s, there was Dr. Bahari. He was working with AIDS patients exploring naltrexone, and he sort of stumbled upon what the presentation calls a paradoxical effect.
Paradoxical.
Yeah, paradoxical, because he was using doses way down at like 0.5 to 4.5 milligrams, so maybe 1% of that standard dose.
Wow, just 1%. And paradoxical meaning it did the opposite of what you'd expect from the high dose?
Kind of, yeah. Instead of that total sustained blockade, this really low dose seems to cause just an intermittent block, a brief one.
Like a quick tap, not a wall.
Exactly, or like a quick tap. That's a good way to put it, not a permanent wall. And this brief interaction, this sort of tap, it seems to set off a whole different cascade of responses in the body compared to that full block.
Okay, so this fleeting intermittent block at a super low dose. How does the source explain that? How does that translate into potential effects on things like inflammation and, ultimately mental health?
Well, the presentation outlines a couple of key ways they think this intermittent block works. First, that brief blocking action seems to interfere with pro-inflammatory cytokines.
Cytokines, remind me. Signaling proteins.
Yeah, think of them like messenger proteins for your immune system. Crucial for fighting threats, right?
Right.
But the pro-inflammatory ones, if they get overactive, they contribute to that sort of low-grade systemic inflammation throughout the body.
Okay.
And the source emphasizes that bulving these, even briefly, can help reduce that widespread inflammation.
Which sounds important for just general health, obviously. But how does inflammation connect so directly to mood? That seems like a big leap.
That's a really critical link the presentation highlighted. It actually attributed a pretty powerful quote to Dr. Bullmore.
What was it?
Inflamed bodies have depressed minds.
Wow. Okay, inflamed bodies have depressed minds.
Yeah, it directly connects that physical inflammation to depression. The idea being if you can reduce that underlying inflammation, you might potentially impact someone's mental state. The source even noted it could be relevant, with current viruses causing what they called cytokine inflammation.
That quote really makes you think differently, doesn't it? About the physical roots of some mental health struggles. Okay, so reducing inflammation is one piece. What was the second major effect they described for this intermittent block?
The other really interesting effect described is that this brief block seems to make your body's own opioid receptors more sensitive.
More sensitive.
Yeah. So when the low-dose naltrexone is only there for a short time and then leaves the receptor, the body seems to respond by becoming more receptive, and it signals itself to actually produce more of its own natural opioids, endorphins.
Ah, endorphins, right. The body's own feel-good chemicals, the runner's high stuff.
Exactly that. Endorphins are basically your endogenous morphine. They naturally help with pain, increase feelings of pleasure, contribute to that sense of well-being.
Okay.
And the source adds that this endorphin boost also seems to enhance dopamine, that key feel-good hormone.
And didn't the presentation also mention this gives the immune system a boost too?
Yes, exactly. That increased endorphin activity is also thought to make the immune system kind of perk up, as they put it.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. As presented, LDN at this low dose is thought to do two main things. Reduce systemic inflammation. AND boosts the immune system, which leads to more endorphins and maybe less fatigue.
That's a great summary of the mechanism they described. It's basically helping the body kind of get back into a better balance. It's optimizing.
That's a really interesting dual mechanism. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, what specific uses, especially for mental health, did the source really focus on?
It explicitly mentioned LDN being used as an anti-anxiety type medication.
Okay.
But importantly, it was often presented as something you might add to whatever someone's already doing, not usually as a replacement, for their current treatments based on this source.
Right, an add-on. And what about depression? The source had some pretty sobering stats there.
Yeah, it highlighted that depression is, a huge issue globally, a leading cause of disability. And the presentation pointed out that even with standard antidepressants, the relapse rates can be significant.
Like how high?
They quoted figures like 40–60% relapse within the first year, people often needing dose changes or having to switch meds.
Wow.
So LDN was presented as maybe a novel approach in this context, something that could potentially be used alongside current medication to, maybe improve those outcomes.
Were other conditions mentioned, particularly ones involving inflammation or maybe autoimmune issues?
Oh, yes, definitely. The presentation discussed seeing success with conditions like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, both heavily linked to inflammation.
Makes sense with the mechanism they described.
Right, and they referenced specific studies too, like a 2007 Penn State study on Crohn's disease, where it apparently reduced inflammation and helped with healing.
Yeah.
And 2009 article connected to fibromyalgia.
And just touching back on its history, was its role in addiction treatment still mentioned alongside these sort of newer low-dose uses?
Briefly, yeah. While the main focus was clearly on the low-dose stuff, its history in addiction treatment was acknowledged. It just shows the wide spectrum of naltrexone, depending entirely on the dose.
The part that really struck me, though, was the emphasis on quality of life, not just ticking off symptoms.
Absolutely. That came through strongly.
Yeah.
The presentation cited some recent work, like an article in the Journal of Affective Disorders, and also mentioned a 2008 study by Dr. Brown. Both suggested LDN can help foster positive emotional states and really enhance overall quality of life.
Which feels huge.
Yeah, the pharmacist giving the presentation felt that broader impact, that quality of life piece, was actually more important than anything. It's about feeling better, functioning better overall, not just suppressing one specific issue.
That way of thinking, it really ties into what the source described as the core philosophy behind how LDN is supposed to work at this low dose.
It really does. They included a very telling quote. It was attributed to Dr. David Ryan, Chief Director at Mass General Cancer Center.
Okay, what did he say?
He apparently stated that LDN does not cure anything. And then he added, it actually doesn't treat anything either.
Which sounds, well, completely counterintuitive if you're thinking about a typical drug that, attacks a disease directly.
Exactly. But then came the crucial follow-up, the real insight. It simply optimizes your body's ability to go fight the disease on its own.
Ah, okay. Optimizes the body's ability.
That's the heart of it, from the functional medicine perspective presented here. LDN isn't positioned as the cure itself. It's seen more as a tool that helps your body activate its own innate healing, its own regulatory systems, basically helping the body help itself.
That connects all the dots, doesn't it? The inflammation, the endorphins. It's about helping the body find its own balance again. So, okay, if someone and their doctor are thinking about this, what practical things did the source cover? Like dosing, timing, side effects?
Right, the practicalities. A major emphasis was that dosing is highly, highly patient-specific. They used words like customized, individualized. There's really no standard one-size-fits-all dose.
So how do they figure it out?
Well, while a common starting point might be around 3 to 5 milligrams, they stressed the importance of titration.
Titration, meaning starting low and going slow.
Exactly. Starting at a low dose and then slowly, carefully adjusting it upwards to find what works best for that specific person. They even mentioned things like starter packs that compounding pharmacies might provide to give physicians flexibility in that titration process.
And when is it usually taken? Any specific time?
Typically in the evening, The source noted that can sometimes be a bonus, potentially helping with sleep for some people.
Okay. And how long does it generally take to notice if it's working? Is it quick?
Well, you might start noticing some benefits within, say, a few weeks, but the presentation was quite clear that the full benefit usually takes longer,
How much longer?
typically 3 to 6 months. And this makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because, like we talked about, it's signaling the body to make these internal regulatory changes. That kind of biological shift, as the source put it, doesn't happen overnight.
That's really good to know for setting expectations. What about side effects? Anything major?
The source mentioned two major ones they tend to see. First, vivid dreams.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, and if that happens, they suggested maybe trying to switch, taking it to the morning instead. The other one was headaches,
And the fix for that?
usually just slowing down that titration process, going up in dose even more gradually. But overall, the presentation stated the side effect profile is really strong, meaning quite favorable. They estimated about 85% of patients do really well on this.
85% is pretty high. Is there anything really critical to watch out for? Any absolute no-goes, contraindications?
Yes, and this was highlighted very, very strongly. A critical point. LDN must not be used at the same time as opioid pain medications.
Okay, so things like Vicodin, hydrocodone.
Exactly. Any of those common opioid pain relievers. Because of how LDN interacts with those opioid receptors, even at this low dose, it will block the effect of the pain medication. It'll basically cancel it out, or worse, could trigger withdrawal. The pharmacist actually shared an anecdote. They worked with a pain patient where they managed this by having the patient take the LDN at night when they weren't typically needing pain meds, and then take their opioid pain medication during the day as required. But it needs careful management.
That makes total sense given its mechanism and history. Okay, and the source mentioned compounding pharmacies. Where do they fit into this picture?
Well, they're pretty essential, actually, because LDN requires these very specific, individualized, titrated doses that just aren't available commercially off the shelf.
Ah, okay.
So compounding pharmacies work directly with physicians to create these custom dosages, and they can even make different forms like liquids or topical creams.
Creams.
Yeah, the example given was making a cream for, say, autistic children who might have difficulty swallowing pills. They could apply the cream, maybe at bedtime, and absorb the LDN through the skin. It just highlights that tailored approach.
It really does show the need for that individualization. Okay, finally, the research landscape. The source touched on that. What was the takeaway there?
They did. They noted that because naltrexone isn't, a new patentable molecule anymore, you don't see a lot of those huge multi-million-dollar, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies like you would for a brand new drug.
Right, the funding isn't really there for that.
Exactly. However, they did mention there's a significant number of smaller studies out there. The presentation cited, I think, over 230 on PubMed at the time, though acknowledging that number might be a bit outdated now.
And what do these studies, even if they're smaller, consistently suggest, according to the source?
The presentation really emphasized that these smaller studies, despite limitations, are consistently showing positive results. They framed LDN not necessarily as a magic bullet on its own, but as a potential key component.
A piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, an important piece in helping people's overall health and, significantly, improving their quality of life. So yeah, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the source material, the core ideas that really stand out are LDN's pretty unique low-dose mechanism, right? That brief intermittent block that seems to signal the body, calm down inflammation, and ramp up your own feel-good endorphins.
That dual action.
A dual action, exactly. And the presentation connects this to a potential role, again, often as an added support, in conditions like anxiety and depression, basically by helping the body rebalance itself. We've looked at the big difference between its original high-dose job and this surprising low-dose effect, learned about that really powerful link they drew between inflammation and mood.
Inflamed bodies have depressed minds.
That's the one. And we cover the practical stuff, too. The individualized dosing, the timeline for results needing patients, those generally mild side effects, and that really critical warning about not mixing it with opioid pain meds. And all of this, drawn straight from that pharmacy presentation, it gives you a really intriguing perspective, doesn't it? Thinking about supporting well-being by optimizing the body's own systems, rather than just intervening with external drugs.
It definitely does. It's a different way of thinking.
So here's something to maybe leave you chewing on, building on what this source described. If the whole idea is that LDN works by simply optimizing your body's own natural fight, its own systems, well, What does that suggest about the potential of other approaches? Approaches that also focus on supporting, rather than strictly suppressing or stimulating, our complex biological functions, especially when we're dealing with really nuanced challenges like mental health.